Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed our last conversation about fast food and quick service restaurants. When we looked at fast food and quick service restaurants, we talked about the idea that service is extremely limited in those situations, where a guest might walk up to a counter, order their food, pay for their food, and then either take it from the counter or have it delivered to the table. Now that we move into our next segment of the restaurant industry, which is going to be family or mid-scale restaurants, we're going to increase the amount of service that we see within these businesses. So the other thing I want you to start to think about as you're looking at or evaluating what is a mid-scale or family restaurant is that this is by far the largest segment that we will be dealing with. And as part of that, it means that we're going to have some restaurants that have less service and less amenities, and some restaurants have more service and more amenities. So price itself is not necessarily a definition of mid-scale, nor is the service itself or the food a definition alone. So let's talk about what that means as we go forward here. So the business model. When we looked at the business model for fast food restaurants, one of the things that keeps the price down is the limited amount of service or the servers or people that we have to pay to deliver the product. As we move into a family or mid-scale restaurant, our cost structure is going to change. I now need to pay a host. I now need to pay a service staff. I need to pay a busing staff. So I have additional people that are working for me in order to create this higher level of service, and as a result, it's going to cost me more money. I'm either going to pass some of that on to my guests, so my food may be more expensive, or I'm going to have to eat a portion of that cost, which means my profit is going to be less in some situations. But what you see in family or mid-scale is full service, which means that you're going to be seated at a table, either by a host, by a server, or by yourself in some situations, and then the order for your food is taken at the table. The food is delivered to you at the table. And then you're going to either pay at the table, or in some of the lower end types of family or mid-scale restaurants, you might take your check and pay up at the front counter, which would certainly be another option. You are still getting full service, but we're taking that pay portion and just putting it off to the side there. So what we do is a little bit different. As I mentioned, price may help to define mid-scale restaurants. It's not going to be as expensive as a fine dining restaurant, theoretically. That doesn't mean it's not going to be potentially expensive or that it's not going to have amenities. So this business model can range from I have no alcohol license, I serve only breakfast, or it could include I have a full liquor license, I serve dinner, I serve appetizers, I serve a multi-course meal. That could still be family or mid-scale restaurants in some cases. And we'll talk about what that gray area is in our next chapter when we look at fine dining restaurants. The other thing I want to mention about family or mid-scale restaurants is the range of ownership options. So we might be looking at a corporate entity. And when most people think about a mid-scale or a family restaurant, we tend to immediately think of the big corporate entities. Usually when I ask students, identify a mid-scale restaurant, Denny's is one of the first ones that comes out. So Denny's or IHOP or something along those lines would be a standard mid-scale restaurant. Limited service, but you still have full service in terms of bringing food to the table. You're going to pay at the cash register instead of necessarily with the server in some cases. You may or may not have an alcohol license. Typically, that's not a large portion of what you sell. But you can also have independent restaurants that are mid-scale, simply because they are in that price range, in that food quality area that is not fine dining, but the level of service is higher than the level of service you would find in a fast food or quick service restaurant. So let's talk about some examples. If we're looking at the corporate, the large entities, we might be looking at IHOP, Denny's, Mel's Diner would be great examples of larger corporate mid-scale restaurants. Local corporate, we might see something like Brookfield's, which has multiple locations and is going to be owned by a single individual or family as opposed to a large corporation. Now, what I will say about the idea of corporate or multi-unit restaurants is one of the things that's extremely important within our industry is if you're going to have more than one restaurant, we call them stores, if you're going to have multiple stores, consistency is the key. So it is very important that you are consistent from one location to the next location in your service, in the quality of your food, in the type of food that you serve. So your corporate entities tend to be very good at that. What comes along with that is also economies of scale, meaning that I no longer need a separate or an HR department that is going to be funded by one restaurant. It's funded by multiple restaurants. If I want to do advertising, it's paid for by multiple restaurants as opposed to a single one. So you gain more economies of scale, you make more money when you have multiple stores. Also, you gain purchasing power, which means that you'll be buying more of something. And now in the case of your produce or in other items, because you're buying more, you may get more of a discount. Again, you have economies of scale where you're going to make more money. Now, even though we tend to think of our mid-scale restaurants as being more large or corporate or multi-store, they don't have to be. So some examples of local independent: Bacon and Butter, which has 2 restaurants at this point. The Paisley Cafe in Orangevale, a small independent owned, limited service. You're still being seated, you're still having a server, but you're not having a full liquor license. They're only serving breakfast and lunch. Now something, when I look at those that are on your screen right now, those are all mostly breakfast, lunch, or all-day menus. But mid-scale or family doesn't have to be. So when we look at larger or broader, I should say, family or mid-scale restaurants, other examples, and they tend to be more corporate: Red Robin, Olive Garden, Red Lobster, Cheesecake Factory. Each of these is a different concept with service. They may have full liquor licenses. They may have a wine list. They will have, typically what we find in some of these restaurants is a relatively large menu. And that is part of the corporate concept, because the corporate concept wants to be able to feed multiple people and give multiple people what they want. That's a conversation for a different class. Texas Roadhouse, BJ's Brewhouse, additional examples of mid-scale restaurants that are going to serve dinner. None of these are fine dining, although they may be nicer restaurants for some folks. They still don't meet the threshold of what we're going to talk about later on as a fine dining restaurant. Right? So our conclusions. Well, what do I want you to take away from this? I want you to understand that the mid-scale or the family restaurant is the largest section that we're going to be looking at in terms of segments of our industry. The other thing that I probably should mention is that while they may not be as profitable on each item as you might find a fast food restaurant or a quick service restaurant, we can still see a great deal of profitability in these restaurants. So these are going to be profitable, but they might be more profitable than what we're going to see in a fine dining restaurant, which we're going to talk about in a little bit because of additional costs that go into that. The other thing to take away from it is thinking about those economies of scale. What do you gain by serving more food, by having a larger restaurant, or simply by having more than one store? So just a couple of things to think about. I want to leave you thinking about what are some other examples of mid-scale restaurants. So as you turn this off, think to yourself, what are 4 or 5 other local or larger corporate examples of mid-scale family restaurants? All right, we'll talk about fine dining in a little bit. Thank you very much.